Long before the world knew him as one quarter of ABBA, Benny Andersson was a boy in the Väsastan district of Stockholm, growing up in a home filled with music that had nothing to do with pop charts. His father, Gosta, a civil engineer by trade, and his grandfather Ephraim were both devoted accordion players, and it was that instrument, not a guitar or a piano, that first pulled Benny into music. At just 6 years old, he was given his own accordion, and his father and grandfather began teaching him Swedish folk tunes and traditional songs passed down through generations. It was an old-world education in melody, rooted in the sounds of rural Sweden rather than anything resembling the glossy pop machine he would later help build. By the time he was 10, Benny had also picked up the piano, teaching himself largely by ear. He left school at 15 and started performing at local youth clubs, eventually joining a folk music ensemble called Elverket Spelmanslag, where he wrote some of his earliest songs. But it was rock and roll, and in particular his discovery of Elvis Presley, that redirected his attention toward the electric sound of the era. That pull toward rock led him, in October 1964, to join the Hep Stars, a band that would go on to become one of the most popular groups in Sweden during the 1960s, so beloved that they earned the nickname the Swedish Beatles. With the Hep Stars, Benny wasn't just a keyboardist. He began writing his own material, starting with a song called No Response, and soon following it with Sunny Girl, a hit that carried his songwriting beyond Sweden's borders for the first time. It was a small taste of what was coming, though nobody around him could have predicted just how far his songwriting would eventually travel. Benny's family background is worth dwelling on because it explains so much of what came later. His mother, Leila, and his father, Gosta, raised him in Väsastan with a younger sister, Eva-Lise, born 2 years after him. Music wasn't a career plan in that household so much as an inherited language, something passed down the way a trade or set of values might be passed down in other families. His father worked as a civil engineer, a steady, practical profession, and there was never any expectation that Benny would follow him into that world. Instead, what he inherited was an ear and an early, patient introduction to melody through folk music and Schlager traditions that had nothing to do with the pop charts he would later dominate. In June 1966, while out on tour, Benny crossed paths with another young Swedish songwriter named Björn Ulvaeus. The two struck up a friendship almost immediately, bonding over a shared fascination with composition and arrangement. Their first collaborative song, Isn't It Easy to Say, was recorded by the Hep Stars, and from there, the pair kept writing together, eventually forming a publishing company called Union Songs alongside music industry figure Stig Andersson, the man who would go on to manage ABBA and shape much of their commercial direction. The partnership between Benny and Björn would become one of the most productive songwriting relationships in pop music history. Their working methods settled into a rhythm that suited both of their strengths. Benny built the musical architecture, the chord progressions, melodies, and arrangements, while Björn focused on lyrics and structure. It wasn't a rigid division of labor, but it was a partnership built on trust, each man deferring to the other's instincts in the areas where he was strongest. Around this same period, their personal lives intertwined with their musical ones. Benny had been in a relationship with singer Christina Granville, with whom he had 2 children, but by the late 1960s, his path had turned toward 2 other Swedish performers who would soon reshape his life entirely, Annie Fridlingstad and Agnetha Faltskog. Along with Björn, the 4 began performing together in a loose touring act called Festfolket, which by most accounts didn't make much of a commercial impact. But the chemistry between the 4 of them, both musically and personally, was undeniable, and it eventually crystallized into the group the world would come to know as ABBA. ABBA's rise through the 1970s is now the stuff of pop culture legend, kicked off in earnest by their 1974 Eurovision Song Contest win with Waterloo, a performance and a song that instantly reoriented the group's ambitions from a domestic Swedish audience toward a genuinely international one. The win didn't guarantee lasting success on its own. Plenty of Eurovision winners have faded quickly, but it gave Benny and Björn a launching pad and an audience willing to pay attention to whatever came next. But the engine behind that meteoric rise was in large part the studio partnership between Benny and Björn, who wrote and produced the entirety of the group's output together. Benny's contributions went well beyond songwriting. He was deeply involved in the arrangement and production choices that gave ABBA's records their distinctive layered, cinematic quality. He was known for embracing new studio technology, including early synthesizers and multi-track recording techniques, at a time when many of their pop contemporaries were still working with simpler formulas. What set ABBA's music apart, and what music historians and critics have pointed to again and again over the decades, was the tension between the bright, major key melodies and the often melancholic or bittersweet lyrical content underneath. Songs like Dancing Queen, on the surface a pure celebration, sit alongside tracks like The Winner Takes It All and Knowing Me, Knowing You, both of which deal directly with loss and heartbreak. That contrast between joyful sound and difficult subject matter has often been credited to the way Benny's compositions and Bjorn's lyrics worked in tandem, creating a depth that helped the group's music endure long after the disco era it emerged from had faded. The catalog that emerged from this partnership over the following years is almost unmatched in pop music for its sheer consistency. Mamma Mia, SOS, Fernando, Money, 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 Take a Chance on Me, Chiquitita, and Super Trooper, among dozens of others, are still instantly recognizable to listeners who weren't even alive when they were written. Behind each one was the same working process, Benny at the piano or keyboard, working out chord changes and melodic hooks, often for hours at a stretch, before bringing those foundations to Bjorn to shape into finished lyrics and vocal arrangements. Within the group itself, the public dynamic often centered on Agnetha and Frida, the two singers whose voices and images dominated ABBA's visual identity, magazine coverage, and much of the media attention that followed the band. Benny and Bjorn, by contrast, were frequently characterized in the press as the men behind the music, a label that undersold just how central their creative fingerprints were on every aspect of the group's sound. It's a common story in pop history. The performers in front of the microphone become the faces of a project, while the writers and producers working just out of frame shape the substance of what audiences are actually responding to. The personal lives of ABBA's four members were, famously, deeply entangled with the group's professional identity. Benny and Annie Frid-Lyngstad, known to fans simply as Frida, were a couple for years before marrying in January 1978. At the same time, Bjorn and Agnetha had also married years earlier, in 1971. For a period, both marriages functioned alongside the demands of international stardom, relentless touring schedules, and the pressures of a band whose commercial success had few precedents at the time. Both marriages, however, would not survive the decade. Bjorn and Agnetha divorced in 1979, a rupture that happened while the band was still actively recording and touring together, and one that inevitably affected the atmosphere in the studio. Benny and Frida's marriage came to an end in 1981, shortly before ABBA's activity, as a group, began winding down. The specific and private reasons behind these separations were never publicly detailed by the individuals involved in the kind of granular emotional terms that tabloid coverage at the time speculated about, and neither Benny nor Frida has offered a blow-by-blow public account of their marriage's breakdown. What can be said honestly, based on the public record, is that maintaining a marriage while coexisting as bandmates through a divorce, and then continuing to write, record, and perform together afterward was an extraordinarily difficult balancing act, one that undoubtedly took a toll on everyone involved. Not long after Benny's divorce from Frida, he married Mona Norklid in 1981, a marriage that has lasted for decades since. Whatever pain accompanied the end of his first marriage, Benny's professional and personal life in the years that followed points to someone who found stability again, both at home and in his continued creative work. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this situation was, even by the standards of famous bands with internal romantic entanglements. Most groups that go through a member's divorce see the relationship, and often the band itself, unravel quickly afterward. ABBA continued recording and touring for a period even after both couples had separated, a testament to how seriously all four members treated the professional side of what they had built together, even as the personal side grew more complicated. It's a detail that resists easy dramatization, but says something genuine about the discipline and mutual respect that held the group together through a period that could easily have ended much sooner and much more bitterly than it did. Contrary to the popular narrative that ABBA's split in the early 1980s was fueled by dramatic conflict, the more grounded and well-documented story is one of gradual exhaustion rather than an explosive falling out. By 1982, after nearly a decade of near-constant recording, touring, and global promotional obligations, on top of the personal upheaval of two divorces within the group, the band's activity slowed to a natural stop rather than a formal breakup announcement. There was no farewell tour, no press conference marking the end. ABBA simply stopped releasing new music together, and the members moved on to separate projects. This kind of quiet dissolution without a dramatic final chapter is actually fairly consistent with how Benny and Bjorn have both spoken about the band's later years in various interviews over time, less as a group torn apart by scandal, and more as four individuals who had poured everything they had into an enormous, sustained creative and commercial project, and who eventually needed to step back from it, separately, in their own ways. Rather than retreating from music, Benny redirected his energy almost immediately into new creative territory. Working again with Bjorn, he composed the music for the musical Chess, which premiered in the mid-1980s with lyrics by Tim Rice, a project that allowed both men to explore a theatrical, narrative-driven style of composition distinct from ABBA's pop format. Years later, the two also collaborated on Kristina Fran de Vemela, a Swedish-language musical based on Vilhelm Moberg's Emigrant novels, which became a major success in Sweden and further cemented Benny's reputation as a serious composer working well outside the confines of chart pop. Both Chess and Kristina Fran de Vemela reveal something about what Benny was chasing creatively once ABBA's pop format was no longer the outlet. Musical theater allowed for longer, more complex compositions than a 3-minute radio single ever could, and it gave him room to explore emotional and narrative territory, war, immigration, personal sacrifice, that simply didn't fit within ABBA's format. Critics and audiences responded to Kristina Fran de Vemela, in particular, as a deeply serious, ambitious work, a far cry from the disco-era image some had pinned on him a decade earlier. In 1987, Benny released his first solo album, Klinga mina klockor, a project rooted in Swedish folk music and built around his original accordion compositions, working alongside the folk group Orsa Spellman. It was in many ways a return to the musical roots his father and grandfather had instilled in him decades earlier, before ABBA, before global fame, before any of it. Since 2001, Benny has also led his own group, Benny Andersson's Orchestra, releasing several albums and touring with a lineup built around dance band traditions distinct from his ABBA-era work. In the 1990s and 2000s, he and Bjorn also played a central role in developing Mamma Mia, the jukebox musical built around ABBA's back catalog, written by playwright Katherine Johnson. The show became a global phenomenon in its own right, running for years on London's West End and Broadway, and was eventually adapted into 2 feature films, reigniting mainstream interest in ABBA's music for an entirely new generation of listeners who hadn't been alive during the band's original run. Decades after the band's activity wound down, ABBA returned to the public eye in a way almost nobody could have predicted. Not through a traditional reunion tour, but through ABBA Voyage, a concert residency built around digital ABBA avatars of the 4 original members, performing alongside a live band. The project, which involved years of motion capture work and significant technical innovation, opened in London and became a massive commercial success, allowing audiences to experience something resembling a live ABBA concert without requiring the now septuagenarian members to tour in person. That project, more than almost anything else in Benny's post-ABBA career, speaks to how he has approached his own legacy in recent years. Less interested in revisiting old wounds or dramatizing the group's history for the cameras, and more focused on finding new, often technologically inventive ways to keep the music itself alive and accessible. It's consistent with the picture that emerges from the full arc of his career, from a 6-year-old with an accordion in Vasastan, to one half of the most successful songwriting partnership in Swedish pop history, to a composer of stage musicals, folk records, and now digital concert experiences. There's no single dramatic confession that neatly explains ABBA's rise or its quiet unraveling, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What the documented record actually shows is a far more human, and in some ways, more interesting story, a musician shaped by folk traditions and family long before fame ever entered the picture, a songwriting partnership built on genuine creative trust, 2 marriages that didn't survive the pressures of extraordinary fame and constant proximity, and a band that didn't collapse in a single dramatic moment, but simply ran its course after nearly a decade of relentless output. Benny Andersson, now in his late 70s, has spent the decade since ABBA's active years doing exactly what he did as a child with his first accordion, making music in whatever form interested him at the time, whether that meant a West End musical, a Swedish folk record, a dance band album, or a hologram concert built on technology that didn't exist when ABBA first topped the charts. If there's a through line in his life, it isn't a single hidden confession waiting decades to be revealed. It's simply a musician who has kept working, kept adapting, and kept finding new ways to put his own stamp on sound, long after the group that made him famous stopped recording together. There's also something worth noting about how Benny has handled the attention that comes with being one of the last living architects of one of the best-selling groups in music history. He hasn't used his later years to stage a dramatic public reckoning with the past, nor has he leaned into tabloid-style storytelling about his marriages or the band's internal tensions. Instead, the pattern across his public appearances and interviews over the decades has been remarkably consistent. Talk about the work, talk about the music, and let the rest remain private. That consistency in an industry that often rewards oversharing and manufactured drama is itself a kind of statement about who he is. It's also worth remembering that Benny didn't do any of this alone. Bjorn Ulvaeus remained his creative partner for the better part of 6 decades, through ABBA, through Chess, through Christina Fran de Vemela, through Mamma Mia, and through ABBA Voyage. Few songwriting partnerships in any genre have lasted that long or produced work across such a wide range of formats, from 3-minute pop singles to full-length stage musicals to a technologically groundbreaking concert residency. Whatever else can be said about the internal complexities of ABBA, as a group, the working relationship between these two men has proven to be one of the most durable and productive in modern music. That, more than any manufactured scandal or invented quote, is the real story of Benny Andersson, and it's one the public record has been telling all along.